The LVR Buyer Brokerage Representation Agreement. Now, this is the new revised Buyer Brokerage Representation Agreement that was launched on 8/16/2024. So this agreement is designed to allow a buyer to engage a qualified licensed professional for the purpose of viewing property and receiving contract negotiation and advocacy services throughout the entire real estate offer and purchase process for the types of property described below. Before we go over the property types, you have to identify whether this is an exclusive agreement or a non-exclusive agreement. Now, exclusive agreement means the buyer is not working with any other agent, and all of our time, energy, and effort is going to result in us finding a property, putting the buyer in escrow, and closing the transaction, getting paid a compensation. Non-exclusive means that the buyer is working with other agents, and it's possible that they end up buying a home with another agent and we do not receive any compensation. Okay. Perfect example would be an investor. Investor says, I'm working with multiple agents. Any properties that you show me, right, you can represent me on and you'll get paid a commission on. Any properties that another agent shows me, you won't represent me on and you won't receive compensation on. So you have to be very clear on whether or not you're willing to do a non-exclusive agreement with a buyer, because we know that we put a lot of time, energy, and effort into our clients, and it's possible that in a non-exclusive agreement, you do not receive compensation, you do not represent that buyer in the purchase of a home that they bought through another agent. Okay. Number one, properties. The undersigned buyer engages the undersigned brokerage firm, broker, to represent buyer concerning buyer's purchase of the below selected real property types situated in the following locations, geographic area. Any real property introduced to buyer by broker in the geographic area shall be referred to as the property. So this is where you're going to select the property types that you're going to be showing this buyer: residential, investment, commercial, vacant land, custom build job, new home, or other, like a high-rise, condo, hotel. You want to make this as open as possible. We know buyers sometimes will start looking for residential resale and end up buying a new home, right? Or they possibly look for residential resale initially and end up buying vacant land to build a home. So again, open this up based on the conversation with your buyer and make sure you're not limiting the property type. Same thing with applicable cities. Okay, we want to make sure that we're not limiting this to a specific city. If it's possible, this buyer is going to buy in a neighboring city. You know, we have Las Vegas, Henderson, North Las Vegas, and Pahrump, right? Clark County and Nye County. So I would recommend put all cities that could possibly apply that this buyer would be buying a home in, and then other description, geographical area, zip code, single or multiple family. Again, be careful. Don't make this too restrictive. If you put a zip code and they buy in a different zip code, it's possible that they call you out on the validity of this agreement. So again, other description could simply be Clark County and Nye County, which would encompass all of the cities here that we operate in Southern Nevada. Okay. The or is check if this agreement relates only to a specific property or properties, right? Those properties is are. This is if it's specific to a property or multiple properties. This agreement is specific to a property or multiple properties. This might be the scenario where you haven't had the opportunity to sit down with the buyer, build rapport, show your value, and sign an agreement that's for any properties that you're going to show them, right? You're going to start looking for homes and start showing them properties. This may be a scenario where you get a sign call, right, from your listing, or an internet lead from your listing, and you're going to show up at that property with this agreement, right, with your duties owed, the supplemental, and with the buyer brokerage representation agreement. Have a conversation with them, and they may say, hey, we don't want to sign an open-ended agreement with you here. We just wanted to see this one property. We're willing to sign this agreement for this one property, or this property and another property, right? 123 Elm Street or 456 Oak Street. Right? You can do that. It's limiting. That's not the goal. We want to make sure this is for, we get to show them all properties. But if that happens, you can start off with selective properties and, of course, work towards building rapport, earning their trust, and then opening this agreement up to, hey, I'm showing you any properties that meet your criteria. Okay. You can also attach an additional sheet if there's more than two properties, right, to this agreement. Number two, length of agreement. Subject to Section 14, which we'll talk about here in a minute. This agreement begins on the date last signed by buyer and broker and automatically ends on, this is the expiration date, or upon the closing of a transaction, whichever is later, the term. So this is your expiration date. And because of Section 14, this really shouldn't be a key focus. The goal of this would be to have as long of an agreement as possible to work with that buyer to identify the property for them and get them in escrow and close the transaction. What you don't want to do is you don't want to limit the time frame too much to where everything's going great, right? You've put in 30 days, 30 days comes and goes, right, as the expiration date, and everything was wonderful, but it expired, and now that buyer goes out and signs another buyer brokerage representation agreement with another agent. So keep this as long as possible. I would recommend 6 months as a window and even a year, depending on the buyer. Okay. Number three, broker fee. Buyer agrees to pay broker as provided below the broker fee for any properties involving the broker's efforts under Section 6. The broker fee is not set by law or by any realtor association and is fully negotiable. The broker fee is. So this is where you're going to put your broker fee. Now this could be 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%. Right? That's the commission that you're going to put in there. Recommend no less than 3%, okay, of the gross purchase price of the property as reflected on the final settlement statement. We'll talk about collecting more than what's included here in a minute. So you put your percentage here or an exact amount, a flat fee amount. So if you're collecting a flat fee, you can put that here instead of a percentage. The third one here is for your broker additional compensation, right? Your transaction fee. This would be the $695 to be paid towards broker additional compensation. Is what you can write there, right? So again, check those that apply. The first one and the third one, or the second one and the third one. Right? The broker fee is due and payable upon successful closing. If buyer enters into an agreement to purchase any property or properties shown to them by this licensee within a certain amount of days following the expiration or earlier cancellation of this agreement, then the buyer shall pay the broker fee to broker upon closing. The broker fee shall be in U.S. currency and paid at the time and as a condition of closing. This agreement shall act as escrow instructions for payment of the broker fee to broker. This Section 3 shall survive the expiration or earlier cancellation of this agreement. So these days you're going to put here basically says, buyer, I'm going to show you homes. Within 90 days of the expiration of this agreement, right, or cancellation of this agreement, right, if the buyer cancels early, 90 days after that expiration or cancellation, if that buyer goes back within those 90 days and buys a home that you showed them, you're due a commission. Okay, that's important. This will keep a buyer from going around you and trying to go through the listing agent or another agent, right? If you've shown them a home and simply because, whether it's because they owe you a commission, right? Maybe the seller's not paying all of the commission and they're going to have to pay you some of the commission, and they've decided to think about it and they try to go around you to go to the listing agent or another buyer's agent. This will hold them responsible to that broker commission. Very important. I do recommend 90 days is a good time frame for this. You can, however, you can go out 180 days if you would like, right? Just think of this mainly being a clause that says, buyer, don't go around me, right? I'm showing you homes. If you want to purchase one of the homes that I've shown you, let's move forward. All right, page 2. Number 4, collecting broker's fee from the seller. Broker may choose to negotiate that the broker fee be paid in whole or in part by the seller as a credit to buyer at closing and or by the seller directly to broker at closing. At buyer's instruction, broker will include either or both of these in buyer's offer to purchase a property, and broker will help buyer negotiate these with a seller. Broker will not retain any amount from any source that exceeds the amount agreed above. That's what I was talking about earlier, is that whatever percentage you put here, whatever amounts you put here, you cannot collect more than that. So if a bonus is being paid, or let's say that you put 2% in here and the seller is willing to pay 3%, you're now stuck with that 2%. Highly recommend you don't put anything less than 3% here. Some agents are putting 4% here to make sure that if there's more than 3% being paid from the seller, right, that they can collect that additional money. Okay. So this is important. As you're talking about the commission section, you're going to explain to the buyer how you're going to work to getting the seller to pay either the buyer's closing costs or, right, could be some of both. The seller's going to pay directly to the buyer broker the commission, right? And this is going to be where you're going to make sure your buyer understands that during the negotiations of the offer to purchase, right, this commission is going to be included in either directly being paid by the seller, or you're going to include some buyer concessions, whereas the buyer concessions would absorb, right? The buyer receives credit, and then the buyer can pay, they can take that credit and they can pay the buyer broker commission. Very important. You have a couple of different opportunities there to collect your commission. Right? Seller may not want to pay all of the buyer broker commission, but they may be willing to pay some of the buyer's closing costs, as most listing agents are going to explain, if not all listing agents, are going to explain to their sellers that the buyer signed a buyer brokerage representation agreement stating that they owed a certain amount of commission to the buyer broker, and they're going to try to collect that through negotiations, whether, again, through directly getting the seller to pay their commission or asking for some of the buyer's closing costs so the buyer can pay some of the buyer broker commission. Okay. Number 5, disclosures. Buyer understands that depending on the circumstances, it may be necessary or appropriate for broker to act as an agent of both parties for each such transaction. In such event, broker will seek buyer's consent to broker's representation of additional parties as soon as practicable and will obtain the written consent to act form signed by all parties. Now, this is if you're representing the seller and the buyer. Right, if you have a listing, you're already representing the seller. So if you found a buyer, if a buyer came to you and wanted to purchase your listing, you would need to go to your seller first and get a consent to act form signed saying, seller, is it okay for me to represent both parties in this transaction? If they say yes, then you go to your buyer and say, buyer, are you okay with me representing both parties in this transaction? If they say yes, they both sign off on the consent to act form and you're good to move forward. Right? Buyer consents and acknowledges that other potential buyers represented by broker may consider, make offers on, or acquire interest in the same or similar properties as buyer. So this would be simply a disclosure that if you're working with another buyer that has interest in the same home as your other buyer, you need to let those buyers know that you're working with another buyer that is interested in going to write an offer on, right, on that same property, because it is a conflict of interest, right? Your buyers need to know that so they don't think that you're doing something shady behind closed doors, and you've not let them know that you're working with another buyer that's has identified the same property. Okay. Broker's efforts. Broker will exercise number 6, broker's efforts. Broker will exercise good faith efforts to locate and present suitable properties to buyer, tour and prepare detailed analysis of specific properties per buyer's request, help buyer prepare, negotiate, and secure a contract to purchase one or more properties, cooperate with any real estate licensee working with the seller to facilitate and complete the buyer's purchase of the property, and perform other services as needed and requested by buyer. Number 7, buyer's representations and duties. Buyer agrees to work exclusively with broker and not with any other broker unless marked otherwise on page 1. That was that exclusive and non-exclusive section. Buyer agrees to furnish broker with all relevant data, records, documents, and other information, including loan pre-approval letters, proof of funds to purchase upon request of broker, authorizes broker to furnish copies to prospective sellers, landlords, optioners, or exchangers. Right, so anything you'll need through that transaction, it could be LLC documents, right? If they're buying in an LLC name, we need to know that they have authority to buy for that LLC, right? And or trust, okay? Buyer agrees to be available to examine properties and responding in a timely manner to communications from broker. Buyer agrees to act in good faith to acquire the property and conduct any and all inspections of the property that buyer deems material and or important. New home lot sales. Some sellers, particularly new home subdivisions, open houses, and for sale by owner, will not compensate broker unless broker makes the first visit with buyer. Right? If buyer makes a first visit without broker, buyer agrees to compensate broker as stated in Section 3, broker fee. So this is if the buyer shows up at a new home, didn't let you know. Very important conversation to have with your buyer, of course. Please do not show up in any new home without calling me first or bringing me with you so you have proper representation, right? The sales agent at the builder site represents the seller, the builder, not you. Again, we teach this in our classes, but it's very important that you let them know don't show up at a for sale by owner's door or at a new home without me, because I might not get compensated, which means you're going to owe me that compensation. Okay. Number 8, for best experience, buyers encouraged to be accompanied by a broker on buyer's first visit to the property and to conduct all negotiations for the property in good faith and exclusively through broker. Buyer understands that signing more than one buyer-broker representation agreement for any overlapping period of time could expose buyer to liability for paying additional fees. Buyer is not a party to any active exclusive buyer brokerage representation agreements. So that's exclusive. Buyer is a party to, you can write the number, right, of active non-exclusive buyer brokerage agreements here. So if your buyer has said, hey, I actually do have 2 or 3 or 4 non-exclusive buyer brokerage agreements out there, you're going to write that number in here, and that's going to advise you that they are working with other buyer's agents to identify a property. Number 9, equal housing opportunity is the policy of the broker to abide by all local, state, and federal laws prohibiting discrimination against any individual or group of individuals. The broker has no duty to disclose the racial, ethnic, or religious composition of any neighborhood, community, or building, nor whether persons with disabilities are housed in any other home or facility, except that the agent may identify housing facilities meeting the needs of a disabled buyer. Right. Number 10, wire transfer. Electronic means of transferring money, right? EFT, ETF, wire transfer, electronic check, direct deposit, etc., are subject to sophisticated cyber fraud attacks. These attacks are even more prevalent in real estate transactions due to the large sums of money being exchanged. Buyers advise that brokers will not provide electronic transfer instructions by email. Following money transfer instructions contained in an email from any party is inherently dangerous and should be verified. Buyer agrees that if buyer uses or authorizes the use of electronic transfer of funds in a transaction, buyer hereby holds the brokerages, their agents, and the designated title and escrow company harmless from any and all claims arising out of the inaccurate transfer instructions, fraudulent interception of said funds, and or any other damage relating to the conduct of third parties influencing the transfer process or stealing funds. All right, we do have a wire fraud disclosure that we have our buyers sign as well, to make sure they're clear, to verify the source of wiring instructions, right, that they're receiving them from. And we as agents never provide our buyers with wiring instructions from title, right? Title needs to send that directly to the buyer, and the buyer needs to verify that they are valid. Number 11, Nevada law applies. This agreement is executed in Nevada, and the laws of the state of Nevada will govern its interpretation and effect. The parties agree that Nevada and the county in which the property is located is the appropriate forum for any arbitration related to this agreement. Page 3, number 12, authority, capacity. Buyer warrants that the buyer has the legal capacity, full power, and authority to enter into this agreement and consummate the transaction contemplated hereby on buyer's own behalf or on behalf of the party buyer represents. All buyers executing this agreement are jointly and severally liable for this performance of all of its terms. Buyer's obligation to pay broker is binding upon buyer and buyer's heirs, administrators, executors, successors, and assignees. Number 13, additional terms. This is where you can write in additional terms. Number 14, cancellation. Either party may cancel this agreement effective upon delivery of written notice to the other party unless buyer is under contract to purchase the properties. What that means is a buyer can email you stating that they want to cancel this agreement and it is canceled. We can do the same. We can send an email to our buyer saying we are canceling this agreement through the broker, right? And it is canceled. Now, if the buyer is under contract on a property, right, they've signed a purchase contract, right, this agreement is still in place, which means once the buyer's in escrow under contract on a property, right, we are still representing them. They can't cancel this agreement. By signing below, buyer and broker agree to the terms set forth in this agreement. Buyer signatures 1, 2, 3, and 4, and of course the brokerage information, and that is your LVR buyer brokerage representation agreement.